September 25, 1978, San Diego, 9:02 a.m. A Boeing 727, a residential neighborhood, 300 miles an hour, 144 dead, 7 of them on the ground, 2 of those, children. 19 seconds before impact, a computer screamed collision. A controller saw it on his screen. He did nothing. How did 3 words, traffic in sight, become the last line of defense for 144 lives? To answer that, we need to go back about 6 hours, to the early morning darkness in Sacramento, California, where a PSA flight crew was walking through the terminal toward their gate. Pacific Southwest Airlines was California's airline, the original low-cost carrier, with sunset-colored stripes and a painted smile under the nose of every plane. Their operating model was so successful that a little Texas startup called Southwest Airlines had copied it almost entirely. PSA had never had a fatal accident in 29 years of flying, not once. The crew assigned to Flight 182 that morning reflected that track record. The captain was 42 years old, a 17-year veteran at PSA, with over 14,000 hours in his logbook, more than 10,000 of those in the Boeing 727 alone. His first officer had 10,000 hours and 9 years at the airline. The flight engineer had been with the company for 11 years, with nearly 11,000 hours total. These were not just competent pilots. By almost any measure, they were among the most experienced crews flying that day anywhere in the country. Their aircraft was a 10-year-old Boeing 727-214, registration November 533 Papa Sierra. The maintenance paperwork showed the plane was in good working order. The weather at their destination, perfect. Clear skies, 10 miles of visibility, temperature already climbing past 80 degrees. A textbook Southern California morning, and a great day to be a pilot. The first leg from Sacramento to Los Angeles was completely routine. Flight 182 touched down at LAX just after 8 in the morning. Some passengers got off, others boarded for the short hop down to San Diego. When the doors closed, the manifest showed 128 passengers and 7 crew. But buried in that number was an unusual detail. 29 of those passengers were off-duty PSA employees, deadheading home to the airline's San Diego base. Flight attendants, mechanics, pilots heading to a training seminar. This was as much a company shuttle as it was a commercial flight. One of those deadheading pilots, a captain named Spencer Nelson, made his way up to the cockpit and settled into the jump seat behind the 2 pilots. As the ground crew pushed the gleaming 727 back from the gate, Nelson struck up a conversation with the captain about contracts and insurance, the kind of shop talk that fills quiet cockpits on short flights. The first officer, who would be flying this leg, ran through the taxi checklist without much comment. At 8:34, Flight 182 lifted off from Los Angeles International Airport. San Diego was only 100 nautical miles to the south, a flight so short that the plane would barely reach cruising altitude before starting its descent. The passengers settled in. The flight attendants moved through the cabin. Outside the windows, the Southern California coastline stretched out under a cloudless sky. But 100 miles to the south, at a small general aviation airport called Montgomery Field, a Cessna 172 had already been airborne for 18 minutes. Inside its cramped cockpit, a 32-year-old flight instructor named Martin Casey was supervising a student pilot, a 35-year-old Marine sergeant named David Boswell, as he practiced instrument approaches at San Diego's main airport, Lindbergh Field. Boswell was wearing a training hood, a device that blocked his view of everything except the instrument panel directly in front of him. He was learning to land using only his instruments. Casey, in the right seat, was his eyes. The pair had departed Montgomery Field just after 8:16 that morning and flown south to Lindbergh, where Boswell practiced 2 instrument approaches to runway 9, the only runway at the airport equipped with an instrument landing system. What made this unusual, even by 1978 standards, was that runway 27 was the active runway that morning. The Cessna was landing against the flow of traffic. It sounds unthinkable today. San Diego is now the busiest single-runway commercial airport in the country, and no small plane would ever be allowed to do practice approaches against the prevailing direction. But in 1978, it was permitted. After the second approach, Boswell broke off the training session and began climbing northeast, back toward Montgomery Field. Lindbergh Tower cleared them to maintain visual flight rules, and handed them off to the approach control facility at Miramar. The two aircraft were now descending toward the same crowded airspace above San Diego, and somewhere in the system that was supposed to keep them apart, there was a crack, one that had been there for years, that people had seen, and that no one had fixed. The Cessna was about to fly directly into it. To understand what happened next, you need to know how air traffic control worked in San Diego in 1978. The airspace around Lindbergh Field was managed through something called a Terminal Radar Service Area, or TRSA, a zone stretching from 4,000 up to 8,000 feet, where controllers used radar to guide aircraft in and out. Below that zone, individual airport towers handled traffic in their own areas, but the boundaries between those areas were poorly defined. Lindbergh Field and Montgomery Field sat less than 6 nautical miles apart, and their control zones overlapped in a patch of airspace that no formal agreement had ever clearly divided. Two separate facilities were controlling traffic in the same sky, and neither had a clean handoff procedure with the other. There was also a facility order at the San Diego Approach Control Center, housed at Miramar Naval Air Station, that required controllers to keep Lindbergh-bound traffic at or above 4,000 feet until clear of Montgomery's airspace. The purpose was simple: keep the big jets above the little planes. But controllers routinely ignored this rule. They cleared airliners for visual approaches without altitude restrictions, sending them down through Montgomery's airspace every single day. It was standard practice, and on the morning of September 25th, it meant that Flight 182 would descend directly into the patch of sky where the Cessna was already climbing. At 8:57, as the 727 passed through 9,500 feet, the first officer reported the airport in sight, and the approach controller cleared them for a visual approach to runway 27 at Lindbergh Field. 2 minutes later, the controller called with a traffic advisory. A small plane ahead of them, 12 o'clock, 3 miles, a Cessna 172 climbing out of 1,400 feet. The first officer spotted it quickly. "Okay, we've got that other 12, he told the controller. Moments later, the controller updated the position. 12 o'clock, 3 miles, now climbing through 1,700 feet. The first officer glanced out the window again. "Got him," he said, and the captain keyed his mic and said the 3 words that would seal the fate of everyone on both aircraft: "Traffic in sight." The controller heard those words and did exactly what the system expected him to do. He told the crew to maintain visual separation from the Cessna, then handed them off to Lindbergh Tower for their landing clearance. From that moment on, the responsibility for staying clear of the Cessna belonged entirely to the pilots of the 727. The controller's job, as far as the rules were concerned, was done. But here is what those 3 words actually meant in practice. When a crew reported traffic in sight and accepted visual separation, they were telling the controller, "We see the other plane, and we will make sure we don't hit it." The controller would then stop providing radar-based separation for those 2 aircraft. No more advisories, no more monitoring. The pilot's eyeballs were now the only thing keeping them apart. This was called the see and avoid principle, and it had been the foundation of collision avoidance in American aviation for decades. But studies had shown, and the FAA had known since at least 1956, that human vision is far from reliable in a dynamic traffic environment. Pilots lose sight of traffic. Small planes blend into complex backgrounds. Closure rates between jets and propeller aircraft can exceed 200 knots. And yet, in 1978, a crew saying "traffic in sight" was enough to remove every layer of radar protection the system could offer. Now, what the PSA crew did not know, and what the approach controller did not tell them, was that the Cessna had just been handed a heading of 070 degrees by that same controller. If the Cessna held that heading, it would cross in front of the 727 and move away to the northeast. The geometry would resolve itself. But if the Cessna turned, if it drifted onto an easterly heading, say 090, then both aircraft would be flying the same direction. And a small white Cessna moving the same direction as a much faster 727, seen from above and behind against a background of houses and streets, would be almost impossible to pick out. It would appear motionless on the windscreen, no relative movement, no way to spot it using a standard traffic scan. The Cessna would simply vanish. And that is exactly what happened. At some point after 9 o'clock, The precise moment is unknown because the Cessna had no cockpit voice recorder. Boswell, or Casey, turned the aircraft from heading 070 to 090 without informing the approach controller. The controller had told them to fly 070. They were expected either to hold that heading or to call and say they could not. They did neither. No one knows why. Maybe Boswell, under the hood, drifted off course. Maybe Casey instructed a heading change and forgot to call it in. The reason died with them, but the consequence was immediate and lethal. On heading 070, the Cessna would have crossed in front of the 727 with roughly 1,000 feet of vertical separation, enough to clear safely. On heading 090, both planes were now flying due east, one above the other, the 727 descending at over 160 knots, the Cessna climbing at barely 100. The overtake was happening at 60 knots, and from the cockpit of the 727, the Cessna, a small, white-winged aircraft against a patchwork of rooftops and roads, was nearly invisible. It was not moving across their windscreen. It was sitting still, growing imperceptibly larger, sinking slowly toward the bottom edge of the glass where it would disappear below the wipers. There was one more factor working against the crew. The Boeing 727 cockpit was designed with a reference point to help pilots position their seats so their eyes sat at the correct height, what engineers called the design eye reference point. From that position, the windscreen provided maximum visibility downward. But during testimony after the accident, PSA's chief pilot admitted that many company pilots preferred to sit slightly lower and farther back than the reference point because it gave them a better view of the instruments under the glare shield. If the crew of Flight 182 had adjusted their seats that way, and there was no way to know for certain, then the Cessna could have slipped below their line of sight entirely, hidden beneath the metal frame of the windscreen wipers. They would have been looking right at the spot where the Cessna was, and seeing nothing but houses. In the cabin below, 128 passengers sat reading, talking, watching the coastline slide by. The San Diego skyline was coming into view. Some of the deadheading PSA employees were probably already thinking about their afternoon plans. None of them had any reason to believe this flight was anything but routine. If you're enjoying this video, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps us keep making these stories. Now, let's continue. At 9 o'clock, Flight 182 contacted Lindbergh Tower and reported on the downwind leg. The tower controller immediately advised them. Traffic, 12 o'clock, 1 mile, a Cessna. This was the same Cessna, but in the 20 seconds since the approach controller's last advisory, something had changed. The Cessna, without telling anyone, had turned right, from heading 070 to 090, due east, the exact same heading as the 727. And now the first officer, who had been the one to spot the Cessna earlier, was busy flying the airplane, calling for flap settings, and looking at the airfield to set up his visual approach. He was the pilot flying, and the one making most of the radio calls, a workload that left very little capacity for scanning traffic out the window. The captain asked, "Is that the one we're looking at?" The first officer answered, "Yeah, but I don't see him now." Those 6 words should have triggered an immediate call to the tower. "We've lost sight of the traffic." That call would have changed everything. The tower controller would have provided updated position information. He could have told them the Cessna was still directly ahead. He could have stopped their descent. But that call never came. Instead, the captain keyed his mic and said, "Okay, we had it there a minute ago." Then, a few seconds later, "I think he's passed off to our right." And here, a single syllable became the difference between life and death. On the cockpit voice recorder, the captain most likely said past tense, meaning the Cessna had already gone by. But on the tower controller's tape, distorted by radio static, the word sounded like passing, present tense, meaning the crew was watching the Cessna go by at that very moment. The controller heard passing and concluded that the pilot still had the Cessna in sight. He turned his attention to other traffic. He did not ask for confirmation. He did not check his radar display. As far as he knew, the 3 words from 2 minutes earlier, traffic in sight, were still true. They were not. Inside the cockpit, the confusion was now obvious. The captain said, "He was right over here a minute ago." 20 seconds of silence followed. Then the first officer asked the question that should have gone to the tower. "Are we clear of that Cessna?" The flight engineer said, "Supposed to be. The captain said, "I guess." And from the jump seat, Spencer Nelson added, "I hope." Someone laughed. No one picked up the microphone. The captain then offered a theory. "Oh yeah, before we turned downwind, I saw him about 1 o'clock, probably behind us now." But the Cessna had never been at 1 o'clock. Before the turn, it had been at 11 o'clock, almost the opposite direction. Whatever the captain saw, it was not the Cessna. Investigators later examined 16 witness reports of a possible third aircraft in the area, but found no radar evidence to support it. The crew of Flight 182, in those final seconds, may have been tracking a phantom. Meanwhile, at Miramar, a conflict alert began flashing on the approach controller's radar screen. The computer had calculated that Flight 182 and the Cessna would pass within 375 feet vertically and 1.2 nautical miles laterally within the next 40 seconds. This system had been installed just 1 month earlier. In that month, it had averaged 13 alerts per day, most of them false. Controllers had already learned to treat it as background noise. And the last thing this controller had heard from the PSA crew was "traffic in sight," now more than 60 seconds ago. He looked at his screen. The two targets were so close that their altitude readouts overlapped, and he could not read them. He could have separated them with the press of a button. He did not press it. He concluded that no conflict existed. He did nothing. The approach controller later testified that he could not be certain the conflict was real because the altitude readouts for both aircraft had merged on his screen and were unreadable. But investigators found that he could have separated those readouts with a single keystroke, a manual offset function built into the radar system. He did not use it. He also did not call the Lindbergh Tower controller to ask whether Flight 182 still had the Cessna in sight. He did not instruct the Cessna to turn. He had the tools. He had the time. He had 19 seconds. And the reason he did nothing was simple. The system had trained him not to act. The conflict alert had been installed 1 month earlier. In that month, it had gone off an average of 13 times a day. Most of those alerts were triggered by aircraft that were already maintaining visual separation and posed no real threat. Controllers had learned that the alarm usually meant nothing. Some pilots had testified that they would happily fly within half a mile of another aircraft as long as they could see it, well inside the alert threshold. So the controller looked at the flashing warning, remembered that the PSA crew had said "traffic in sight" over a minute ago, and made a judgment call. He decided the system was crying wolf again. It was not. 19 seconds remained. The first officer called for gear down. Clicks and a thump filled the cockpit as the landing gear extended. Then the first officer said something strange. "There's one underneath." A pause. "I was looking at that inbound there." No aircraft was inbound to any nearby airport at that moment. Whatever he saw below them, he did not identify it as the Cessna. The flight engineer, still talking to company operations, was not scanning traffic. The captain, searching out the right side of the cockpit, had his attention elsewhere. The Cessna was 400 feet below them, directly ahead, wings level, climbing. At 9:01 and 45 seconds, the captain saw it. "Whoop!" he shouted, a reflexive gasp as the white shape materialized from below the windscreen wipers. The first officer screamed. There was no time to turn, no time to climb, no time for anything. At 9:01 and 47 seconds, the right wing of the Boeing 727 slams into the back of the Cessna 172 at a closing speed of nearly 200 knots. The impact tears the small plane apart instantly. Both occupants of the Cessna are killed on contact. Pieces of the Cessna spiral downward. The vertical stabilizer, bent and shattered, tumbles toward Polk Avenue. What remains of the fuselage drops like a stone. On the 727, the collision strips 30 feet of leading edge from the right wing. Kruger flaps, slats, structural skin, gone. The Cessna's fuel tank lodges inside the wing and ignites. Fire streams from the trailing edge in the 727's wake. The right wing begins to lose lift. The left wing does not. The aircraft starts rolling right. The captain says, "Easy, baby, easy, baby." The first officer fights the yoke. Full left aileron, full nose up. It does nothing. The bank steepens, the nose drops. "What have we got here?" the captain asks. "It's bad," the first officer says. "We're hit, man. We are hit." The captain keys the mic one last time. "Tower, we're going down. This is PSA." The tower controller answers, "Okay, we'll call the equipment for you." The stall warning begins to sound. The 727 is now in a graveyard spiral. 50 degrees of bank, 50 degrees nose down, fire consuming the right wing. Hundreds of people on the ground look up. They see the orange and white jet, trailing flame, arcing down toward the rooftops of North Park. On the cockpit voice recorder, the captain makes one last transmission to the cabin. "Brace yourself," someone says. "Ma, I love ya." Then the recorder stops. At 9:02 and 7 seconds, PSA Flight 182 strikes the intersection of Dwight and Nile Streets in the North Park neighborhood of San Diego. The impact registers on a seismograph 2 miles away. A fireball engulfs the block. Wreckage and debris scatter across 22 homes. All 135 people on the aircraft are killed. Both occupants of the Cessna are killed. 7 people on the ground are killed. 5 women and 2 boys, including a daycare owner and her 4-year-old son, and a young mother and her 3-year-old who had just pulled into the driveway. It is the deadliest air disaster in American history at the time, and it happened on a cloudless morning with 10 miles of visibility, in airspace monitored by radar, between 2 aircraft that 3 separate controllers knew were there. The investigation that followed uncovered a system built on a dangerous assumption. The NTSB initially ruled that the probable cause was the flight crew's failure to comply with the maintain visual separation clearance, specifically, their failure to tell the controller when they could no longer see the Cessna. The air traffic control procedures that allowed controllers to defer to visual separation when radar was available were listed as a contributing factor, but one board member refused to sign. Francis McAdams, a veteran investigator known for challenging narrow conclusions, wrote a dissent that would eventually reshape the findings. He argued that ATC procedures deserved to be elevated to probable cause, not just a contributing factor. The system, he wrote, had allowed controllers to abandon the most effective means of separation in favor of the least reliable one. Radar existed, altitude readouts existed, conflict alert technology existed. It had literally sounded an alarm 19 seconds before impact. And yet the entire system defaulted to 3 words from a pilot's mouth: traffic in sight. McAdams called the see and avoid principle outmoded. He said it should never be used as the primary means of separation in high-density terminal areas. He was the only one who said it. But he was not the only one who knew. 9 years before this accident, in January 1969, another PSA Boeing 727 had collided with a Cessna 182 during climb-out from San Francisco. Both aircraft survived that time. The conclusion was identical. Both pilots failed to see and avoid the other aircraft. Nothing meaningful changed. 22 years before that, after the 1956 Grand Canyon mid-air collision that killed 128 people, a study concluded that only the widespread use of proximity warning devices would reduce the threat of mid-air collisions. That warning sat in a filing cabinet for 2 decades, while the system continued to rely on pilots looking out the window. At the nearby St. Augustine High School, the gymnasium was converted into a makeshift morgue. Refrigerator trucks lined up outside. Nurses numbered body bags in the 100-degree heat. Priests administered last rites to remains that were no longer recognizable as human. A firefighter named John Rankin, walking toward a burning house, realized he was stepping on a mound of bodies. He looked up and saw more, hanging from a tree. He closed his eyes. "This is not happening," he told himself. Then he opened them and went back to work. The crash site remained cordoned off for an entire year. In 1982, the Airline Pilots Association successfully appealed the NTSB findings. The board adopted McAdams' position. The probable cause was amended to include the air traffic control procedures as a direct cause, not just a contributing factor, and the changes began. The FAA established a Class B airspace over Lindbergh Field, requiring all aircraft within it to carry altitude reporting transponders and receive positive radar control. Visual separation could no longer be imposed by controllers. It had to be requested by pilots. Conflict alert procedures were rewritten to require controllers to verify resolution, not assume it. Practice instrument approaches by light aircraft were banned from Class B airspace around major airports. And the crash of PSA Flight 182 became one of the catalysts for the development of the Traffic Collision Avoidance System, TCAS. When the technology was finally mandated for all airliners in 1991, it added something that did not exist on that September morning in San Diego, a machine that does not assume, does not mishear, and does not look away. TCAS gives pilots direct, automatic warnings when another aircraft gets too close, and tells them exactly what to do about it. It does not rely on 3 words from a human voice. If you found this story worth your time, we have hundreds more like it. Check them out right here. And if you want to support what we do, consider subscribing. It truly makes a difference. Today, San Diego International Airport, still on the same site, still using the same single runway, is the busiest single runway commercial airport in the United States. Dwight Street has been rebuilt. The houses are new. The trees have grown back. There is no memorial at the intersection where 144 people died. Just a quiet residential block where, once a year, someone leaves flowers on the sidewalk and writes names in colored chalk on the concrete. And every aircraft that descends over North Park on its way to runway 27 carries a machine that listens for the one thing the system failed to hear that morning. The moment when traffic in sight is no longer true.